Please sit down. Thank you for joining us here, Ms. Gale.
Thank you, Commissioner. Now, Mr. Fossey, I want to ask you some questions about specific tasks that you undertook in your role as COO before you were appointed CEO. And one was the early release of funds to patrons, where the funds had been sent by telegraphic transfer to one of the casino's bank accounts, but there was a request to make the funds available to the patron before they had cleared in the casino's bank account or on the same day they were deposited. Now, you were one of 3 people who could approve the early release of funds in those circumstances, weren't you?
I believe so, yes.
The other 2 were the person who held the role of CEO and the other CFO.
Yes.
Now, I want to take as an example a series of approvals for an early release of funds that you gave in late 2018, early 2019 in relation to patron AH on your sheet there.
Yes.
And if we just have, not on the public screen, please, the document CRW.700.000.1429. Now, this is a set of documents that was prepared through the cage, presumably, for the processing of the release of these funds. You didn't receive a whole bundle of documents, did you? It was usually just an email.
Typically, it'd be a phone call that I would approve, and then I'd get an email at a later point.
1432, please. So here we have an email to you from Jared Campbell of the 3rd of January. This is sitting in the bundle of papers for this telegraphic transfer. And is the point you're making there that there would be this exchange, this email exchange, but it was usually preceded by a verbal request and a verbal approval?
Yes.
And so the email would be the confirmation of the verbal exchange. Is that right?
Yes, typically.
Yeah. Now, the email would usually be the only information that you were provided for when your approval was sought. What factors did you take into account when deciding whether or not to approve the early release of funds?
When I received a phone call or on the email. Well, I'd get a call at whatever time of night.
So the question is just what factors would you take into account?
Okay. From my perspective, I'd get a call. I'd be advised who the customer was. Is it showing up in the bank account? Has the customer provided a receipt and the details associated with that confirms the transaction occurred? Typically, it had come through, and because it was the same day, the bank wouldn't process until the following day. If you had to go back some time, it might have taken more than one day. And just to verify the details.
So when you say who the customer was something you were interested in knowing, were these patrons typically known to you individually?
I may not have met them, but I would know of the reviews we'd undertaken on those players typically and who they were.
Right. So, and then when you went on to describe looking at whether or not the money had shown up in the casino's bank account and evidence of it having been deposited to the bank account, that was, you were concerned to ensure that the casino was actually going to receive the money for an early release of funds. Is that right?
Yes.
Did you have regard in deciding whether or not to approve an early release of funds to whether or not a transaction might seem suspicious in terms of possibly facilitating money laundering?
I'd like to think that was a consideration, yes.
The hesitation in your answer, is that something you took into account or not?
A suspicious transaction, yes.
And what would you do if you thought it was a suspicious transaction?
I've in the past declined transactions.
How many times?
can't recall. I can't recall.
How far
Over
back in the
extended period.
past? How far back in the past?
Would have been a period of time over the years, or would have gone back a few years. I can't give you a year. I can't. I'm not exactly sure.
Approximately how many times?
Not very often.
Talking a handful or less?
No, more than a handful over a period of time, but not a great deal.
And your refusal to approve a transaction through because of its suspicious nature, was that usually documented?
I don't know whether it was documented in the cage records.
Well, did you document it?
No, I've received. I know I've received emails that linked to, that spoke about a decline. I give you a customer recently, but I'm not exactly sure what other documentation there was. Typically, I'd speak to someone rather than write it.
Pre-Bergen, you would refuse an approval typically verbally and not in writing.
If it didn't come up on the email, I'd have a conversation with the teams involved thereafter to get further confirmation, to follow it up.
In relation to early release of funds approval, did you ever have regard to whether or not funds should be approved having regard to RSG considerations?
Yes,
Typically?
typically the nature of the transaction or the time periods between transactions.
But you would refuse, would you, an early release of funds if you thought that a patron was, through this transaction?
I have, yes.
Just let me finish the question. Exhibiting a problematic relationship with gambling.
Yes.
How many times?
I don't know, not many probably.
And you'd
Handful
document
in that sense. Some may have been documented. I can't recall.
Well, I suggest to you that if you were refusing to approve an early release of funds either through the suspicious nature of the transaction or through RSG considerations, you would have documented it because you would have wanted somebody else to take other action, such as
Yes.
raising an SMR or referring them through to the responsible gaming staff.
Yes. In
So
the
is that what
instance,
happened?
in the instance of the patron at the top of the list, I have referred that individual to RG and also the AML team for further review.
When you were approving the early release of funds, did you ever ask for information beyond what was contained in the email or what you were told on the phone?
In some instances, is there any more to this on the right-hand side of the screen, or is that?
Let's have a look.
Just want to see what's on the
Page
email.
1433 to the side by side with 1432, please. No, other way. 1433 to the right-hand side of 1432. Oh, it's the last page, I'm sorry. So that's all there is.
I may, on what I see here, I may have asked for further information than what's here.
Just have a look at the table that you've been sent by Mr. Campbell, and for patron AH, you see that there are 3 entries.
Yes.
2 at the top, 10158, 10157.
Yes.
And the second last one, 10173. See that?
Yep.
It's 2 transactions, one for $3,000, one for $5,000 on 27 December 2018.
Yes.
One transaction for $5,000 on 3 January 2019.
Mm-hmm.
And you gave that approval.
Yes.
See that? Now, I just want to set that out and go to this document, which is not for displaying on the public screen, crw.700.080.1652. And if we go to, so this is another set of early release documents at 1654. You're asked to approve 2 $5,000 deposits for patron AH on the 29th of December. Sorry, between those 2 lots of transactions I just showed you, and you do. So in summary, you approved the early release of funds deposited between 27 December 2018 and 3 January 2019 in an aggregated amount of $25,000 by way of 5 separate deposits, all under $10,000. Is that?
Yes.
And it must have occurred to you at the time that those deposits were potentially structuring. Did it?
Well, 2 parts to the answer to that question. It was a possibility. However, customer AH, Patron AH, that is his typical behaviour in terms of his buy-ins in the amount of, can I say the amount? $5,000. It's his typical buy-in amount. He'd play to the conclusion potentially of those funds, and then at a later point in time during the course of the evening may request further, depending on when he visited. Typically there'd be no further releases that I'd approve for a customer, as in a third in the day. That wouldn't happen.
But did it occur to you that these multiple amounts, 2 lots of 5,000 rather than 1 lot of 10,000, was possible structuring?
In the case of this individual, no, because of his typical behaviours that he undertook. These are not uncommon gaming buy-in levels. You'll see these as quite a common number. Round numbers is what's used. I would like to relay that to what his play behaviour may have looked like at the time. That would indicate whether some ML activity may have occurred.
But what's the rationale for not considering it suspicious where there's 2 $5,000 deposits on the same day?
Well, if the customer then, if you look at the gaming behaviour and the customer loses somewhere between $5,000 or $10,000, then in that instance, that's part of a gaming behaviour. I'm not sure that's an effective ML strategy. What it can lead to is a UAR to be raised in today's terms, or an SMR at the time.
But you were saying earlier that you would actually refuse funds that refuse to release funds that were suspicious.
You said there was consideration on some instances that occurred, not in all instances. It depends on the customer involved and my knowledge of their typical behaviours as a customer. These customers have varying ways that they choose to gamble with us. These are frequent high-end customers, so I have some understanding of what their typical behaviour is. I balance that, understanding also that have engaged with RG and AML with these customers to give me some level of confidence that we've done the reviews we should have. I ask questions of the operational team when approving these releases about the behaviour of the respective customers. So from my perspective, I have a broader view, I think, of what the customer than what you may see in an email.
So you were aware, were you, that these deposits were being made to the Riverbank Investments account?
Not at the time. I was told it's in our bank account. I didn't ask which bank account. There were a number of bank accounts.
Why didn't you ask about the Riverbank account?
It's not a question I would ask what bank account it's gone to. That's not the only location that someone can send money to. We've got multiple accounts.
So the Riverbank account didn't have any particular significance to you over and above any other casino bank account?
At the time, it was one of the accounts that a customer...
Not the question I asked. Not the question I asked. You didn't see it as any different from any of the other casino bank accounts?
That customers use.
Yes.
A bank account is a means for a customer to transfer their money across.
Come back to the question, please. The real
Yes.
bank account,
Yes.
you didn't understand to be any different in nature to any of the other casino bank accounts that patrons deposited money into?
In 2018, it was the bank account that money was being transferred into.
Now, did you have regard to Patron AH's AML CTF risk rating when you were considering whether or not to approve the early release of funds?
I wasn't aware of his risk rating. That was
Something you could have found out, couldn't you?
yes, I could have, having spoken to legal representatives, having spoken to the AML teams. I would have and asked for reviews on this customer. I would have thought that that would have been a piece of information that may well have been provided as well.
Well, did you say, well, before I approve any early release of funds where I've got these multiple transactions under $10,000, I want to know the AML CTF rating for this patron?
Not at the time, no.
Why didn't you do that?
He hadn't been brought to my attention by the team. When I asked for reviews, they undertook reviews. They were comfortable with the player from the reviews. I've got to rely on my subject matter experts in the various areas to provide me with information that may make decision making more effective, and including at an executive level.
But what about you being proactive, Mr. Bossy? You've got to give an approval for an early release of funds, and you said you took AML considerations into account when you did, and on occasion you refused to release funds on an early basis. Why wouldn't you proactively say, well, I need to know the AML CTF risk rating for these patrons before I decide whether to approve or not?
At the time, I can't recall whether. It was from my perspective, the concern lay in player behaviour. To the extent I've got a concern, I escalate it with the appropriate teams to provide me information. The risk rating, I would have hoped would have been part of that information that I got provided. I don't recall receiving that risk rating on customer AH. Not at the time, no.
And coming back to Patron yes, you accept, do you, that you were involved in approving early release of funds on multiple occasions for Patron AH in 2019?
Yes.
And typically those transactions that you were approving were of the nature of the ones I've shown you, where there were a number of deposits, 5,000 or under, 10,000 under.
They with this customer, they largely would have been.
Yeah, and there was a similar arrangement in relation to Patron AI, wasn't there?
Yes.
We've made up Commission's made up an aide memoir from the TT documents for Patron AI, which is we just put this on the just on the room screens, pcrc.007.008.001. Patron AI. And you'll see there multiple deposits on the single day, $10,000 or under.
Which one am I looking at?
You're looking at the table.
Oh, the table, yes.
So that was something you routinely did in relation to Patron AI?
Yes.
And you didn't regard any of these transactions as potentially suspicious?
Not dissimilarly to Patron AH. The customer had a set level of behaviour. We understood who the customer was. We understood the source of wealth of the customer.
You're the one
Yes.
that's approving.
Yeah. Understood the source of wealth of the customer at the time. The KYC component
What did you understand about the KYC component?
the reviews we did on these customers. I say we because it comes under direction of we need multiple teams to do the reviews, from operational teams to second line defence teams. We knew who these customers were, in terms of their source of wealth, their general valuation. In some instances, depending on who they are, in some instances, in these ones, some of their associates. In some there was a number of factors that we looked into it.
This goes over the page, I think. Just keep looking. So that goes down to June 2019. And I think there's another page. Is there? Okay, thank you. And did you ever have regard to RSG considerations in relation to Patron AI?
I did.
In what way?
When you get a number of these transactions, one of the areas I look at is I speak with the RG general manager.
Did you do that here in relation to Patron AI?
I have done it with Patron AI. I don't know if it was specifically here. This is a 12-month window of 8 transactions or whatever the number is.
Well, if we have a look at this document, just not on the public screen, CRW.700.037.1360. At page 2710. In relation to Patron AH that I took you to a moment ago. See, Patron AH had gambled for over 24 hours in the Pearl Room.
Yes.
2018, and I think between June 2018 and November 2019, you'd approved early release funds in an amount of about $384,000 for Patron AH. So,
yes.
Did it occur to you at the time that you shouldn't be just approving those funds without referring Patron AH through to an RSG officer?
I did refer Patron AH a number of times to RG, who did a review on that patron and came back with a satisfactory assessment. In this instance, the patron had a couple of substantial... I haven't seen the detail of this particular case of Patron AH. The play period, again, you've got to look at the detail. We've done a number of case studies on or a number of bits of research on these players. This particular individual plays tables whereby you might have one card, but you may be rated on more than one product if he's moving around between tables. So I've got to have a look at the accuracy of the ratings here.
So, did you ever refuse the approval of an early release of funds for Patron AH?
I believe I have.
In writing?
It would have gone to... Well, the cage receives those, and oftentimes they would write that that funds weren't early released.
Aside from approving the early release of funds deposited into Perth casino bank accounts, looking at your role as COO more generally, would you agree that during your time as COO, in that role, you had a responsibility to investigate and address issues of concern that came to your attention in respect of gaming operations?
Yes.
For example, if it came to your attention that a patron was regularly attending Perth Casino and was suspected of engaging in money laundering while on the premises, did you consider you had a responsibility to check with the AML team to satisfy yourself that any money laundering risk was being appropriately addressed?
Yes, in that instance, it would also have included the legal and security teams.
And that would also include you considering whether or not the patron should be excluded from Perth Casino.
Yes,
If it came to your attention that a patron who regularly attended the casino had criminal associations or a significant criminal history, did you consider you had a responsibility to consider whether that person should be excluded from the casino?
yes,
Or if it came to your attention that a patron who regularly attended the casino was suspected of being addicted to gambling or suffering harm as a result of gambling at Perth Casino, did you consider you had a responsibility to check with the RSG team to satisfy yourself that the risks to the patron were being appropriately addressed
yes,
and whether the patron should be excluded from Perth Casino in their own interests?
yes.
Do you say you discharged those responsibilities during your time as COO?
I believe I did. In where I was informed of them and I was aware of them, I did engage with RSG regularly. I engaged with AML and the legal team regularly.
Did you engage with RSG regularly? Yes or no? I didn't quite hear what you
Yes.
said. You did?
Yes.
Right.
Regularly on players, I certainly had issues with. If it was brought to my attention, typically it'd be escalated through, depending on the time period. Back in 18, it would have been escalated through the legal and compliance team because AML reported through there, RG reported through there, and security reported through there. So the fastest way to get action would be going through that team.
So just in terms of things coming to your attention, as COO with overall responsibility for the gaming operations, did you consider it important to liaise with the security and surveillance team on a regular basis?
Surveillance team, I did not. Security, I did engage with security.
Did you try to ascertain from either security or surveillance on a regular basis whether any regular patrons were frequently or repeatedly being reported as associated with suspected incidents of money laundering or undesirable activity at Perth Casino?
Typically, that would come through to the executive team directly to security. Back in those days, no, I'd go through the legal lead as the reporting lines.
But was there a structure in place so that you would be told if a name was repeatedly coming up as someone who was engaged in suspicious behaviour while they're at the casino or exhibiting problematic gambling behaviour?
Was there a structure? Yes. Did it work effectively? Not necessarily.
What do you mean by that?
In preparation for my evidence for the Royal Commission, information was brought to my attention that I did not get to see previously.
Commissioner, it'll now be necessary for me to ask you to close the hearing room for about 5 to 10 minutes.
And all right, well, can we stop the live streaming, please?
a name and we're live streaming, is that an issue for us or not in these codes?
That we've left this area,
I'm trying.
so we'll be fine once
Okay.
we live stream it now. And there's not a problem because
Yep.
we'll be able to edit it out of the transcript. Ms. Cale.
Thank you, Commissioner. Now, I want to ask you some questions about Patron K, Mr. Bossy. Patron K came to your attention in 2016 or 2017 as a high turnover player of EGMs.
Sorry, Ms Cahill. I don't know that we've resumed live streaming. Yes.
Start again. Thank you, Commissioner. I want to ask you some questions about Patron K, Mr. Bossy. Patron K came to your attention in 2016 or 2017 as a high turnover player of EGMs, didn't he?
In 17, yes.
In 17.
Yes.
And if we go to CRW, this is not for the public screen, crw.700.045.6479_R, we see Patron K in the number one of the top 5 EGM players for Crown Perth for September 2016. He has a turnover there of $756,748 for the month. Is that how we read that?
Yes.
Right. And you received monthly information of this type in your role as COO, didn't you?
Yes.
Because the top gamblers by turnover were the most valuable to Crown Perth, weren't they?
Yes.
And you considered it your responsibility to know who those top gamblers were
Yes.
and to make sure that they were well looked after
Yes.
and continued to give their patronage to Crown Perth at that high level of turnover.
Patronage, yes. We have a much broader customer base, so it doesn't have to remain that high.
Patron K was in fact the number one EGM player at Crown Perth between July and December 2017, wasn't he?
Yes.
So if we go to not for the public screens, please crw.700.045.6515. Top 20 EGM players, 3 July to 3 December 2017, and there is Patron K with a turnover of about $2.5 million in that 6-month period.
Yes.
You got this information and you were aware of it at the time,
Yes.
didn't you? Weren't you? You were aware
Yes.
of it at the time. And you understood Patron K to be a local patron resident in Perth,
Yes.
and it was the case, wasn't it, that the amount he was gambling and gambling on EGMs would have raised an immediate question in your mind about potential AML and or RSG considerations.
Discussion did occur on Patron K during the course of that period.
Well, let's be plain. When you've got a local individual turning over $2.5 million at the casino in a 6-month period, the question that is front of mind for you is, first, where is he getting his money from to gamble at these levels? And second, is it causing him harm to gamble at these levels? Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Did you make any inquiries along those lines? First of all, in 2016, after Patron K was identified as the top EGM player for September.
We go back 2016 or 2017?
crw.700.045.6479_R. So that's for September 2016.
I would have thought that's September 2017 looking at the play.
Right.
I may be wrong.
Well, let's go back to the 6-monthly figure. CRW 700-045-6515. Now, did you make any inquiries about Patron K in terms of RSG or AML considerations or concerns when you received this data?
Prior to receiving that data, this came out in December. In the middle of October, I had a conversation with our machines general manager of Premium. He's now the director of machines local Premium, about Mr. Petkoff and what information we have on
Patron K?
Patron K. Sorry about that. Patron K. And we made some inquiries in terms of obtaining information on what we knew of this player. I'd also received a call, I can't remember, pre or post, as a similar time period, from one of the team in Melbourne, who was also visiting there, and his level of play there was significant. I then escalated that discussion to our, again, through our legal head to get to RG and AML to undertake a review of this customer. I then pursued or followed up with our manager to get further information on Patron K. We received some information at that point in time of his family and possible wealth that coincided with or supported this information.
Shall we go to the documents, Mr. Bossy? Shall we have a look at what you're describing, but by reference to the documents you're referring to?
Yes.
So let's go to CRW.700.072.3121, not on the public screen, please, at 3122. The back. And here we are in October 2017. This email was forwarded to you by Xavier Walsh at Crown Melbourne.
Yes.
And Crown Melbourne is raising the question of looking into Patron K. There's a statement about his occupation, and he seems to fly in and only do overnights. Those were Crown Melbourne trips that were they organised with the assistance of Crown Perth staff?
No, I don't believe so. This patron, as we found out, lived in Melbourne prior to moving to Perth, not long before this.
Now, do you say that you did any inquiries, made any inquiries about Patron K before this email was forwarded to you in October 2017?
He did come up in discussion.
I'm asking if you made any inquiries about Patron K. You did something proactive and initiated something without anyone else telling you to or raising it with you first?
Prior to this occurring, I believe I had a discussion with my GM in terms of what he knew about
Who was that?
this patron, the person that's on the next email, Richard.
It's Richard Smith.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So let's go to the 3121. Now, Xavier Walsh has forwarded that email to you, and then you, as we say these days, flick it on to Mr. Smith. Richard, can you see if we have anything on this patron?
Yes.
I thought you had made inquiries.
We were discussing this patron previously from a business perspective. So we looked at it from would have been a couple of months earlier about who he was from a marketing and business perspective, part of which was to find information. can't recall the dialogue we had. Once we got to this point, obviously coming in from the Melbourne team and looking at the play behaviour he had in Melbourne in one weekend, that escalated the need for information.
So let me
Because I
understand
wasn't
this. Sorry, let me understand this. You had previously inquired about this Patron for marketing reasons, and then Crown Melbourne was raising, well, this is a bit unusual, he's spending more, his turnover is markedly higher than previously, and looking at his occupation, these things don't fit. So you had to start from here, looking at it from a different point of view.
No, well, what I said is a couple of months earlier, we spoke about it. I had a different lens on at that point in time.
Marketing lens.
Well, at that point in time, he was, I don't believe a few months earlier, he was our largest player. He did, in September was when his play started to elevate. And then this conversation, obviously this email triggered a much closer look at what the behaviour was. His play level was substantially different in Victoria than what it was in Western Australia. Hence, he was raised
As
in
at
Melbourne.
October.
Oh, just if you go back, the play level on that weekend was substantially more than we'd see. Yeah.
As the top EGM player in that 6-month period.
Yes, if you go back to the previous slide,
See his occupation,
yes,
and that was 2.5 million turned over in a 6-month period.
my understanding when he joined the Pearl Room was that he was a hotel manager. Now, how accurate that information is had us rethinking this.
Well, in late October, you're told by Smith what this chap's occupation is, that he's a very private person, talks about his travel patterns. That doesn't give you enough information to assess AML or RSG risk, does it?
That's the point at time that gives me some information. What we
Doesn't give you enough, does it? That in itself does not give you enough.
that gives there's further information you could get on this player. That's very, very strong information. This player came from a wealthy family. This player had properties. And so there was a series of other factors to take into account. I spoke with the head of legal to do a review. At a later point in time, we did do over the course of the coming period.
So let's
We did
have a
an
look
AML
at
review.
that. Let's have a look at that. CRW.700.072.3032, which is not for the public screens, please. Put this on, put both pages up, please. So you'll see in the second half of the page, you're now being, from the Melbourne people are now emailing you directly with Xavier Walsh about Patron K, giving some previous years' play history and saying, well, there's a significant increase for this year and in the average bet. That must have alerted you to some concerns at that point.
Yes.
And you then forward that on to Mr. Smith. We can see at the top of the left-hand page, well, let's hasten our review. No? This is in October,
Yes.
late October.
Yes.
But nothing happened at Perth Casino, did it, between late October and mid-December to hasten the review?
We were getting extra information on Mr. Petkoff. I also raised it with we were getting additional information, Mr. Petkoff.
Mr. Peacock.
Mr. Peacock, yeah, Mr. K, Patron K. And we also had the legal and compliance team doing their AML and associated reviews on that in order to proceed with the next phase of the process, which is a barring process.
Well, we'll see the next thing that comes out of Melbourne in mid-December 2017. Not for the public screens, please. CRW.700.072.3101 at 3103. 3103. So here we've got Crown Melbourne describing, while Patron K is at Crown Melbourne for the weekend, an attempt to engage Patron K in conversation. Had Crown Perth sought to do the same thing by this time?
Yes.
Who precisely?
We had in our Tom is from the gaming team. We had our gaming people engaging with Patron K and obtaining the same information of that sense as well, and a request also to waypoll at around the same time to get information on Patron K to see if there are any matters outstanding there.
Right, let's just try and get this chronology correct. So here we are in late December, and in Melbourne there's this engagement with Patron K. Second paragraph, he gives very bare details of being involved in property development and doesn't even give the name of the development or investment group that he's involved in. So this would be hardly sufficient information from which to form a reliable assessment of his ability to gamble at the levels that he was gambling. You'd agree?
Yes.
At the top of 3101, your reaction to this forwarded email is you say to Mr. Smith, please review, this is on the 19th of December, our team may be able to assist. Were you in the dark at this stage about what information, if any, your team in Perth had been able to elicit about Patron K?
There was further information that was in process. Mr. Smith informed me about that. I also had conversations with the legal team and we had other processes in place going there.
Right, so let's go to the customer details register for Patron K, CRW.700.072.00. This was a database that was maintained by Crown Perth, is that right?
Yes.
0097 see here that 2 days after that email where you said our team may be able to assist, we've got an update from the this is the General Manager, yes, of Security and Surveillance, Mr. Lee. Police have no information on the patron. And then known to be from a wealthy family. So did you think that might require a bit more substantiation than that?
Yes, they had more information than that.
Who did?
Mr. Preston had more information than that.
Which isn't in the details register.
Maybe in other parts of it, I'm not sure.
Right. It notes that the turnover for this patron has effectively trebled from 2016 to 2017. You see that?
Yes.
And at 0096, you see the yearly loss as for 2017 at $669,000 compared to the previous year of 128.
Yes.
So certainly Patron K's occupation would suggest that his income would not, from his occupation, would not support such losses. You'd agree with that? That's obvious.
From his occupation, yes.
So you'd have to know an awful lot more about his wealthy family and his property developments before you could make a rational conclusion that his financial position justified his very high level of turnover. Would you agree?
Agreed.
At 0093, we can see here that at the bottom, you've obviously inserted on the 22nd of December this email from Mr. Kessler at Crown Perth. Do you see that?
I didn't insert it. It was in someone's inserted it.
Just say, I'm just referring to the information provided by Lonnie Bossy. You see that?
Yes.
So you must have provided that to security
Yes.
and surveillance, something like that. So this is on the day that you've said you've received the email from Crown Melbourne. You've asked Mr. Smith to assist, and Mr. Kessler has responded to Mr. Smith on that day. This is the information he's been able to collect on Patron K. It says he's a very reserved person, etc. And then when we go over the page, we get to the numbered paragraphs after it sort of describes his character and personality. And then we get the numbered paragraph 1, his occupation, which you already knew. Numbered paragraph 2, how he feels about his job and how his occupation sits with his family history. Then it numbered 4, it talks about work in Victoria previously. And then at numbered 5, trying to get some more information about him because so little is known. And then I think if we go over the page, Mr. Kessler's gone on to LinkedIn and then he's looked him up on Facebook, and happily they have a mutual friend. And so he's looking at Patron K's pictures on Facebook. He says, well, looking at those pictures as he's growing up, for lack of a better term, there's just an air of wealth. Was that a sufficient substantiation of his financial position for you?
No.
And then Mr. Kessler goes on to say that Patron K and Mr. Kessler's mutual friend on Facebook just happened to be the boyfriend of Mr. Kessler's best friend. And so then there's this sort of second-hand information about Patron K's family background and what one might regard as sort of community gossip about somebody's position, financially or otherwise. Surely that could not have satisfied you as to Patron K's financial position. Would you agree?
Agreed.
And in fact, Mr. Kessler ends the email saying a lot of this is speculative. You'd agree with that?
Yes.
And you could not have relied upon this information to satisfy yourself that the source of Patron K's gambling funds were legitimate or that he was not gambling more than he could afford to. You'd agree with that?
Yes.
And therefore, in the absence of being able to access any reliable information, you should have simply approached the matter by asking him to requiring him to provide financial documentation to support his gambling position. Would you agree?
Yes.
Why did you not do that then?
Certainly, processes we've got in place today are far different. At the time, I didn't ask for that information. I could have, and should have.
Now, 2 months later, in February 2018, he was excluded, wasn't he?
He self-excluded, yes.
Self-excluded. And you see CRW.700.072.3179. This is not for the public screen. And if we look at 3180, so Mr. Patron K has attended responsible gambling and self-excluded, right? And then if we go over to, back to page 3179, your response at the bottom is to say, thanks, Richard. You didn't stop and think, oh my goodness, I've made a terrible mistake here. I've overlooked signs of potential harm to Patron K.
The discussions I was having was with the legal team on this matter, and we should have barred him earlier.
What's it got to do with the legal team, Mr. Bossy, to provide RSG intervention to somebody who you ought to have identified was gambling above their means?
Well, I talk about the legal team in a broad aspect. They are, at the time, they were structured with AML and RG, and the discussions I was having was at the exec level on that matter. I should certainly have stepped in at an earlier point.
Now, you became aware later in 2018 that Patron K had been charged with a criminal offence, the proceeds of which were likely to have been used for gambling at the Perth casino.
Yes.
You were involved in the decision to then issue an NRL to Patron K in October 2018.
I believe that's when it occurred.
CRW.700.085.4638, not for publication on the public screens, please. You were involved in this decision, yes?
Yes.
The notice is issued for RSG concerns, not on the basis that Patron K had been charged with a criminal offence. Can you just explain that reasoning?
I'm
for
not
the
sure
commissioners?
that the reasons are placed by the security team who issue these barring notifications.
You have to be consulted in relation to barring notices, don't you?
Yeah, the question I get asked is typically the barring. The reasoning used is not something I necessarily will get asked.
Not relevant to you?
It's not that it's not relevant. The barring is the relevant component for me.
Well, there needs to be a jolly good reason to bar somebody, doesn't there, from the casino?
Yes.
And you need to make sure that that's conveyed to, that they're only barred for good reason.
Yes.
So you need to know the reason.
Yes.
So why did you understand Patron K was being barred in October 2018?
For fraud with respect to Westpac.
And do I understand that although you need to know the reasons why they're being barred and being satisfied about those reasons, you're not necessarily interested to know whether those reasons are accurately conveyed to the patron?
The reasons for why the barring occurs is discussed. I don't see the actual barring notice and what's written in that. That's the responsibility of the security team to issue barring notices. I haven't followed up to see what's recorded in the system. I understand why he got barred, and that's discussed.
You consider that the oversight by Crown Perth of Patron K's high turnover on EGMs in 2017 was adequate?
We should have done better than that.
Is your answer no?
No, it wasn't adequate.
Do you consider that your own oversight of Patron K's high turnover on EGMs in 2017 was adequate?
I have to take responsibility for that. In my mind, we did go through some processes, but we should have accelerated, in which case it fails the adequacy test.
And you accept, don't you, with hindsight, you ought to have been more proactive about ascertaining whether his level of turnover was supported by his income and was not causing him harm?
In hindsight, yes.
And you agree, don't you, that a better approach than the one you took would have been to require Patron K to provide financial documentation to support his level of turnover on the EGMs?
A better process would have been the ones that we have in place today, which is exactly
A better approach
those.
at the time would have been to require him to provide financial documentation to support his spend on the machines.
It
Yes?
would have been, and it wasn't a process we had in place at the time.
In 2017.
Yes.
And also what you should have done is if he had failed to provide you with adequate financial documentation, then he should have been excluded at that point. Would you agree?
As we would today, yes.
And do you agree that Crown Perth should have taken steps to exclude Patron K from the casino at an earlier point in time than when he was excluded in October 2018?
Yes, prior to October 18, certainly, prior to February.
Now, I want to talk to you about Patron J, please. You gave some evidence on the last occasion about the cheque cashing facility that was available to domestic
Commissioners,
patrons.
can I just, sorry to my friend. I know you don't always take a break in the afternoon. My colleagues and I have had a break outside, but the witnesses have been going for an hour and a half now. I just wonder whether it might be appropriate to have a short break.
We do need to take a break for the benefit of our transcribers, and if Bossy would like it now, we can do that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Commissioner.
We'll, I can't read that clock,
3:32.
2:32. If we come back at 3:45.
All rise.
Please sit down. Thank you, Mr. Just before we reconvene, the question of a non-publication of the name of the patron, the view that we have taken is that if a patron's name is already in the public domain for other reasons, then there is no point in the non-publication order being extending to that patron. So Patron K is Mr. Petkoff, and there is no non-publication order in relation to that name, although we might continue to call him Patron K for
Mr. Bossy
consistency.
will no doubt be very relieved, because I think there was a couple of Petkovs rather than Patron Ks that slipped out, I think, when you were giving your evidence.
Sorry about that.
And I should add, and in this instance, there isn't what I might term loosely a regulatory issue.
So, Mr. Bossy, you gave evidence on the last occasion, or some evidence about the cheque cashing facility that was available to domestic patrons at the Perth Casino, and then you've supplemented your evidence on that by way of your
Yes.
supplementary witness statement. And if we just go to that, CRW.998.002.0614_R at 0615 and following. So page 0615, maybe if we put 615 on the left-hand side and then follow 616. So between 14 and roughly 19, you're explaining the procedure there for the establishing a cheque cashing facility for a customer, and at 19 you explain about in relation to temporary increases of a cheque cashing facility limit that you were one. It's the case, isn't it, that you were one of the authorised company officers to approve temporary increases?
Yes.
And you recall Patron J, don't you?
Yes.
And Patron J was a frequent and regular patron of Perth Casino between 2012 and 2019.
It was It was about a once a week visitor.
Yeah. You regarded him as a high value gambler.
Yes.
Was he a Crown Perth Rewards black card holder from around 2016?
I believe that's about the time.
And black card membership of the Crown Rewards program is the highest tier of membership, is it, offered by Crown Perth?
Yes.
And that tier of membership that he had was a reflection of the amount of money he gambled at the casino.
In his instance, yes. You could also get it from high spend in food and beverage and hotels.
But in his case,
In
it
his
was
case,
from
it was his
gambling. And his game of choice was the table games, was it?
Yes.
Rather than EGMs.
Yes.
And you recall that Patron J, towards the end of 2020, requested information from Crown Perth about transactions on his cheque cashing facility for the period from 2012.
I'm aware of that.
And if we go to this document, not for the public screens, SIE.001.001.0014_R is Crown Perth's response, or Crown's response, dated 27 November 2020. Yes, Crown Perth's response. And what's attached to the response is, as Patron J requested, a copy of the records of his cheque cashing facility. And if we go to some of those records, it includes his application for this facility in 2010 at 0054. Now, this preceded your involvement because you weren't there yet, but that's a $20,000 limit as at 2010. And then if we go to 0057, the facility's limits increased to $30,000 in March 2015. And you approved that increase, is that right?
I believe so.
And then there was a further increase in August 2015 to $50,000 at 0060. You also approved that increase, didn't you?
Yes.
And at 0066 in 2019, a don't think you approved this one, but this was a further increase to $100,000 in 2019. You recall that?
I understand that's his limit.
Or did you recall? Do you recall? Because you were there at the time and you were responsible for the gaming operations as COO
Yes,
of
I understand
Patron
at the
J
time.
having
Yes.
his cheque cashing facility limit
Yes,
increased to
time.
$100,000. And these were all permanent increases to the facility limit, weren't they?
At his request, yes.
Yeah. And you didn't approve this last one, but the ones that you did approve, when you were approving them, did you have regard to RSG considerations?
There was a number of factors.
So I'm
So
just
we can-
asking
it
you
does-
about RSG considerations. Did you have regard to those when you were approving the permanent increase to his facility limit?
Yes,
And obviously you also approved temporary increases in his facility limit from time to time, didn't you?
yes,
And at 0069, we see the beginning of the set of transactions, transactions as a whole on the on his cheque cashing facility. And do we read this correctly on the left-hand side where it says type? TTO is a reference to this time only,
yes,
and that reflects a temporary increase to the facility limit
for the day, yes,
for that particular day. And obviously on the right it says who's the person who has, within Crown Perth, authorised
yes,
that this time only increase. Now, if we go down to about the fifth entry on this page, there's a VTTO. What does that stand for?
I'm not sure. I actually haven't seen one of those before.
And then if we go down a little bit further, past all the, there's a whole bunch of TTOs there, and then you see an STTO.
Actually, V might be verbal, but I speculate.
VTTO might be a verbal this
Might
time
be,
only.
but
Is that possible?
I wouldn't have. In terms of over the phone getting a call, I'm not on site 24/7, 365 days. So this is activated via a phone call, but
By somebody else though, right? It's Mr. Godfrey.
oh, there's some for me as well.
Yeah.
So I'm just not sure what V
So
TTO or STTO is.
there's actually no amount approved in the VTTO and the STTO entries. Does that assist at all?
No. This looks odd for me, but
And then over the page at 0070, there's a reference to a CTTO. And likewise, you can't help us with that.
actually, can you go back to the previous page? I'm just trying to assist here. Help you with what that means. It could be departmental lead. Christian works in the cage, so
Now, what the Commission's done, Mr. Bossy, is we've distilled the data from this in relation to the TTOs, this time only temporary increases, into an aid, which is PCRC.007.007.001. And what we've done here is identified where on the right-hand column you've authorised the increase. Where it says NA in that right-hand column, that's where you have not authorised, but all the others are where you have. And if we
Yes.
just look at the first page, beginning in 2012, you can see when the limit was $15,000. And in that first 6-month period, the number of times you approved a temporary increase to $30,000. How much was drawn in excess of the $15,000 limit and the loss that Patron J incurred as a result of drawing amounts in excess of the limit. And then we can go through to the next page. That's in the second half of 2012 and then over into 2013. And we can cursor through 2013, 2014. 2014 on page 4. We just keep scrolling through. You see that the vast majority of temporary increases are authorised by you. Till we get to the last page with some totals at the bottom for the period between 2012 and early 2019. Before we get there and I ask you specific questions about that, it's the case, isn't it, that you routinely approved significant temporary increases in Patron J's facility limit between 2012 and 2019?
Yes.
And did you have regard to RSG considerations when you did so?
I had regard in terms of the patron understanding, the patron at the time, in terms of the people who'd given me a call on the ground. I'd asked them to review the patron from signs of RG whilst he's playing. On occasion, I saw him in the room. Also from the perspective of possible RSA.
RSA?
Yeah, responsible service for alcohol. So from my perspective, there was those factors that I would typically ask about prior to doing that. And I've also spoken to Patron J about this process and his level of comfort with that. Also looked at financial transactions and if we had any issues with those. And we also did a series of reviews on the patron in terms of his business and various matters in terms of his financial interests.
Well, Mr. Bossy, when at any time you were being asked to approve a temporary increase to a cheque cashing facility limit, it must have occurred to you that RSG considerations were the most important, or at least one of the most important considerations you should be having regard to. Would you agree?
Yes.
And you appreciated, didn't you, that if a patron wasn't seeking to permanently raise their cheque cashing facility limit, the reason could well be either that they couldn't afford to, or they were trying to self-impose a limit on their gambling in a particular session. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
So a request for a temporary increase needed to be viewed by the approving party, such as you, with special care and with RSG considerations at the fore. Do you agree?
Yes.
And if we look at your approvals of temporary increases, as I've just scrolled through this 8-page document with you, we see frequent and regular temporary increases that you approved in significant amounts over the 7-year period between 2012 and 2019. You accept that?
Yes.
And it must have occurred to you, having regard to the frequency and the amount in respect of which temporary increases were sought and the consistency of that conduct over 7 years, that Patron J may not be able to control his gambling. Yes?
He through conversation and his demonstrated behaviours, the way he visited, the way the time of days, his mannerisms when I saw him, there are many factors that we took into account.
Didn't the actual pattern of temporary increases tell a much clearer story about his inability to control his gambling, Mr. Bossy?
It can be interpreted that way. Some customers implement a technical limit as a first benchmark in how they play. But in this instance, it was a conversation I had with him about that behaviour, and he did not give me that indication.
And did you refer him to RSG staff?
I've had conversations with the RG team. I
Did
don't
you
know.
refer him to the RSG staff?
Me referring him
Yes.
directly.
Yeah.
I certainly had that discussion with him, whether he took it on in one side of the equation.
When did you do that?
Later in the piece, it probably would have been about 17, and discussions in 19.
Did you document that?
No, I didn't document it. I was talking to him on site.
Well, it's terribly important to document these things, isn't it? If you've recognised the potential for harm to a patron,
Yes.
and you're trying to minimise that harm, it would be very important to document a procedure to make sure that there's a clear record
Yes,
of the
it
steps
would.
that have been taken. So did you do
Should have
that?
done. No, I spoke to him on site, and I spoke to the team. But in terms of documentation, no, I did not send it.
If we go to the bottom of this document, the totals, we see there that all in all, Patron J drew and therefore gambled $2.43 million in excess of his permanent limit by way of temporary increases 7-year period, and of that 2.43 million, you were responsible for authorising 1.685 million. See that?
Yes.
And there was a $700,000 loss, so $100,000 a year on average, that Patron J lost through authorisations by you of temporary increases.
Can you repeat that comment?
See the $700,000
Yes.
there? That's a calculation of the losses from gambling in excess of his limit through the temporary increases.
I'm not.
Well, I wonder whether that's entirely accurate. It's a very round figure. The creators of this document, I'm not sure, have gone to the player's record of losses in actuality. So I'm not sure that's a fair question or it's a fair representation of what's occurred.
Also, I don't think the players' wins are reflected there as well, because all the areas away from the losses are all equal to precisely 0.
Were you motivated to approve the temporary increases to Patron J's cheque cashing facility in order to facilitate and encourage Patron J to gamble more?
No.
Were you motivated to approve the temporary increases to Patron J's cheque cashing facility so as to benefit Perth Casino's bottom line?
No, there's not a customer in the property that is significant enough to risk elements such as licensing, in my concern. But so no, that's not a reason.
To your knowledge, Patron J was given gratuities in recognition of the large amounts of money he spent gambling at Perth Casino, yes?
Yes.
As rewards for the amount that he gambled,
Yes.
and to encourage him to continue spending on gambling at Perth Casino at the levels that he was.
Not necessarily at the levels he was.
Well, you wanted to continue him to continue to maintain the high level of turnover that he was engaging in on the tables.
But equally, if his level of play declined, he would be eligible for rewards. That's part of the loyalty scheme.
Well, the rewards are linked to how much you spend. Isn't that right?
Yes, but everyone in the loyalty scheme gets rewards.
But this is a loyalty scheme where you can earn rewards through gambling.
Yes.
And the more you gamble, the more rewards you get.
Well, not only through gambling, as part of your membership base, without doing anything as a member, you get rewards.
But we've established that this was how Patron J got
In
its rewards.
Patron J's instance,
And in addition to the sort of more formal reward scheme, you were involved directly, weren't you, in providing benefits to to Patron J in 2019, which was a year when he gambled with turnover of some $26 million.
in what?
You
what was the
invited
start of the
Patron J
question?
to have lunch with you on 2 occasions that year, once at Rockpool Restaurant and the other at the Racetrack.
He actually invited me.
He invited you.
Yes.
Did you not pay for the
Ultimately,
lunch?
I paid for it. He invited me. He wanted to catch up with me for lunch.
And you went
Yes.
because it was good for business.
He was a customer that was very articulate. He provided feedback in our operation more broadly than just in gaming, in our food and beverage operation and others. And I saw that as an opportunity to have multiple discussions with him.
So it was sort of market research, was it?
There was an element of that. There was also an element to talk to him about his gambling.
So it was a counselling lunch as well?
It was at lunch. There are numerous topics of discussion. With Patron J, that included politics, that included the state, that included mining, included a lot of things.
You also invited Patron J to a group dinner at Silks that year in 2019, didn't you?
Can't say I necessarily recall that.
Did you have from time to time group dinners that you hosted for high value gamblers?
On occasions, yes.
And that was a reward to those high value gamblers or high volume gamblers, and a motivation to encourage them to continue to gamble at that high volume.
Those dinners, and I had some lunches as well, were more about receiving feedback on what we do and what their perspectives are on how we deliver the experience to the customer and the game to the customer.
Really, Mr. Bossy?
Yes.
No element of trying to stimulate particular individuals through a reward style program?
No, these conversations with our premium customers were often, how do I put it, fairly blunt in what they wanted as an experience and what typically where we would fail in our processes. So it was a very different type of conversation.
Would you accept that during your time as COO you prioritised profits from high value gamblers at Perth Casino above RSG risks?
I was, I would say, profits were important to the business. As I touched on earlier, we were in a position where, particularly in the midterm of that period, where the economy wasn't very strong. We looked to try and stabilise the business to save jobs. I also worked closely with the RG and the compliance teams to try and create a particular environment that we could fundamentally, again, broaden the customer base to make it for a more stable, successful business, less reliant on high-end customers, which is where we are today.
I want to take you to the check. Okay, so I'm going to take you to your supplementary witness statement just on the room screens, please, because I want to take you to a paragraph that's the subject of an NPO, so we need a redacted version. Can you do that? So your supplementary witness statement is CRW.998.002.0614 at page 0616. Quite sure why that's the subject of it. I'm not sure, Commissioners, why this might be the subject of an NPO, but we just need the unredacted version, please. While the operator's looking for that, I'll ask you this, Mr. Bossy. Ms. Straline has provided a witness statement to this commission where, in one paragraph, she expresses her understanding that Crown Perth is no longer offering cheque cashing facilities to any patrons. Is that the case?
No, we have cheque cashing facilities available to, I think it's 7 patrons. We are not, anyone who's requesting it is not, sorry about that, is not getting those facilities.
So sorry, there's 7 people who have the facility.
That have had the facility for quite some time.
Right.
And they, over the next, every 2 years, we update those, they have to, every 2 years, they have to review their application form and they won't be reviewed going forward. So she's correct in saying cheque cashing facility is phased out, but there's 7 people that have currently got it as a result of history.
So why is it being phased out?
Because banks aren't dealing in personal cheques anywhere near they once did, and discussions with banks indicate that personal cheques, my understanding is that the cheque process will be phased out.
When was the decision made at Crown Perth to phase out the CCF procedure?
We've been discussing the end to that facility since we had our first instance of banks not accepting some cheques because they were cheques. So we've been talking about for quite some time. I'm not exactly sure when we updated the process. It would have been fairly recently.
I don't recall you mentioning that on the last occasion. Is it a decision that was taken subsequent to and because of your examination in August when questions were asked of you about the cheque cashing facility?
I don't know. It was around that time, maybe slightly before or after, but it was more about we've been discussing the viability of the cheque cashing facility for some time due to the arrangements with banks.
Now, paragraph 24 of your supplementary statement identifies one aspect of the cheque cashing facility procedure. As I say, I'm not quite sure why that's the subject of an NPO, but let's just move along for the time being, or an application for an NPO. What is the purpose of that procedure, and particularly the time period that is elapsed, that has to elapse before the cheque is banked?
Purpose. I don't recall. It's been there since well before I arrived. The 5 days were, I believe, written into the casino manual.
You
don't know what the purpose is.
You don't know.
No, that's been in the processes since well before I arrived.
Now, just final topic, Mr. Bossy. I want to come back to the existing culture, the present culture at Crown Perth, I don't want you to repeat, because you've given quite a deal of evidence today already, both at the very beginning and then when I was trying to ask you about the previous culture, you
Yes.
gave a lot of evidence about the current day culture at Crown Perth. So I don't want you to repeat anything that you've already said.
Yeah.
But you obviously accept in your role as CEO now, you are primarily and ultimately responsible for Crown Perth's culture
Yes.
and its attitude to risk.
Yes.
Now, when Ms Coonan gave evidence to the Commission on 12 August, she testified that she thought there'd been a huge amount of cultural change at Crown to that point, which is to be inferred she means in a positive sense, and in the last year or so.
Yes.
You would agree with that, would you, that there's been a significant improvement in the culture at Crown Perth in the last year or so?
Yes, it's improved.
Significant improvement?
At particular levels, any definition of what you think culture is?
You're there on the ground. Do you say that there's a significant improvement at Crown Perth across the board or just in pockets?
I think at the leadership level, it is the improvement continues. I think, as I sort of touched on earlier, the challenge with culture is in these challenging times, people react in very different ways in what we're going through. So a measurement of culture right now is an interesting time to do one, but so it's hard to tell. If you look at over time, for me, I'm looking at 2 to 3 years, and in that intervening period, we've had COVID lockdowns, we've had a whole lot of investigations, the whole series. But I think fundamentally, we have a positive cultural base to work with.
Well, Ms Coonan gave evidence that Crown now has a risk-aware and compliant culture. Would you say the same thing of Crown Perth specifically?
I think we're much better now.
Would you say that Crown Perth now has a risk-aware and compliant culture?
We're better, still work to do.
Ms Coonan said that the prevailing notion now at Crown Group level is if you see something, say something, do the right thing. Again, would you say that is the prevailing notion presently at Crown Perth?
That's what we're trying to instill in our team, yes.
Do you feel you've made any significant inroads in that regard?
Yes, particularly over recent times.
Which do you describe as what? What is recent times?
Particularly over the last 6 months, as our frameworks and our support teams have strengthened. That's given our teams greater visibility, support and understanding of what risk and compliance is in terms of support and communication mechanisms. I think we've improved in our communication to our teams, both in the simplicity of that communication to get very challenging concepts through our team.
Have you seen any of the Deloitte's reports prepared in respect of cultural surveys undertaken within the Crown Group?
So yes, I've seen some of them.
Most recently, the report provided that breaks down the survey results for the individual properties, including relevantly Perth Casino.
Yes.
So if we go to crw.701.006.3776, we go to 3795 where the Perth results begin. With summary results at page 3796, and if we blow up 3796, you've reviewed those presumably
Yes, I've had
with
a look
some
at these.
care
Yes,
and some interest, no doubt.
absolutely.
Do these results align with your perception of the culture at Crown Perth?
From my perspective, if I look at this as a set of research results, I think they are from a perspective of ranking order. I think that makes sense.
In terms of the responses,
Yes.
Now, if we just pick out a couple of particular responses, we just have a look at this first grouping at the top of the page, and inconveniently, not entirely in numerical order, but if you can pick out item number 9, survey responses for "I'm confident I will not be penalised for raising concerns." Only 55% of those surveyed at Crown Perth strongly agreed or agreed with that proposition. Does that
Yes.
response cause you concern?
From my perspective, I wish it was. I'm looking to get it higher.
Does that cause you concern?
At the current state, it causes me concern, but we're working at developing this. As I said, that when I look at these responses here, I start with the highest result, which is compliance is everyone's responsibility. So there's an acknowledgement there of the importance of compliance. If you look at the next 5 to 6 responses, they're all about the confidence that individuals have in their functions, in the rules and regulations they've got to work with. So the individual's got a sound understanding of where their responsibilities are. That goes based on the quantum of the research, which is 2,000 staff to your frontline team. So that gives me confidence that the frontline team understands broadly what they're doing. They understand compliance is important to our business. As you go through the organisation, some of these speak up processes need to get stronger, and so that where that sits, I acknowledge and accept there's more work to be done. However, on a platform where individuals know what their functions are and they know that compliance is important, the speak up process is building on something that's got a reasonably solid foundation, I would have thought.
If we look at item 13, the people I work with bend the rules when it suits them. I understand the way you read this is that only 40% of respondents strongly disagreed with that proposition, which leaves 60% who do not strongly disagree.
Double negatives
the people
are
they work
fantastic.
with bend the rules when it suits them.
I had a meeting when I first saw these. I had a meeting with my leadership team to go through these results. Asked them about bend the rules as one of the phrases I asked them about. Their responses to that included from a and I'll have to go to multiple departments because most of the people here are not in gaming in this research. Conventions people, when they were dealing with conventions, if they offered in trying to get a convention to book, you escalate to senior managers to offer improved discounts and offers within their authority levels. The junior members of team consider that bending the rules because they don't have the same authority levels. From an F&B perspective, if staff are asked to make cocktails in a particular way, these are the examples they used. If they made them slightly differently because a customer asked for it, the F&B team said that's a bending of the rules concept. From a gaming perspective, screens recording results, how we dealt with failures of those screens were deemed bending the rules because a majority of the staff aren't in a position to authorise certain elements of how we do that.
So, Mr. Bossy, you're giving me these examples, are you, to say that, well, when you actually drill down to examples of what people are talking about when they answer a survey in the way in which they have, they're not examples that one should be overly worried about, particularly in relation to the management of AML risk or RSG risk?
No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm providing is a framework of understanding what bend the rules may be interpreted. What I like about this piece of research is that it is very structured, it is reliable, it is repeatable, which gives us an ability to, over time, assess our progress, focus on areas where we need to improve. That is one of them, absolutely. And I accept I lead that in getting that culture and that response brought forward. and fast-tracked, and here I've got some evidence that I can work with and work towards improving that result.
Well, let's look at 3797 in landscape, please. So I understood you to say a moment ago that some of the survey result examples you were giving were not, or the respondents were not involved in gaming, but in fact the business units across the board have been surveyed, haven't they? And
The
here
entire
we have,
operation's been
Yeah.
surveyed.
and so, for example, in that first left-hand column we have cage and count. And it's broken down into their survey results, which gives
Yes.
you a measure against the average that you can look at by business unit. And you'll see about 2/3 of the way along, you've got executive office,
Yes,
and that's your area, is it? That's where you sit?
that's the team there.
I beg your pardon?
Yes,
So if we come down to 13 again and have a look at that just as a example that we've looked at before, people I work with bend the rules when it suits them. 86% of your office disagreed or strongly disagreed with that.
I asked them specifically about that question, and their interpretation was that it's positive, that they don't bend the rules.
Yes, I'm more interested in
They don't bend the rules.
what Cage and Count thinks about the people that work with them bend the rules when it suits them. Only 41% strongly disagreed with that proposition. So it might be a bit of a different situation down there at Cage and Count,
Yes,
which is a pretty big AML risk, you would think.
yes.
And
Part of our exercise at the moment is understanding what causes that response. As I said, I started with the leadership team to get an understanding of what they thought would cause some of these responses, because we've got some work to do. I know I've got some work to do. And until you understand where that detail is, it's hard to develop ways to respond most effectively with our staff. And part of that process we're currently doing is evaluating the detail sitting behind this.
you've been in a leadership position since 2013 at Perth Casino, Mr. Bossy. Are you telling the commissioners you don't really have any insight into why the Cage and Count survey would elicit a response like that?
Well, when you look at the line across the board, it's fairly consistent in the larger operational areas.
I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. 41% of Cage and Count disagreed or strongly disagreed the people they work with bend the rules when it suits them. That leaves 60-odd% who don't violently disagree with that proposition. That's a worry, isn't it?
Yes, I've agreed to that
And
previously.
it seems to be, as you point out, with variations. Not the only sort of anomalies are in executive office and legal and regulatory. That's sort of
And marketing,
very
human
typical
resources. So it's a front of house frontline. When I said operating teams, that's that first 5 or 6 columns.
if we go over the page to 3798, and we look at item 27, which is third from the bottom. My managers and or supervisors put their own self-interest ahead of that of Crown and its customers. And again, you get this anomaly of high numbers strongly disagreeing in executive and legal regulatory, and only low numbers disagreeing in the operational areas. That's a concern, isn't it?
Yes.
And then if we go to 3799, at item 42, it's the second last from the bottom. Executives and general managers at Crown consistently behave in accordance with Crown values. 71% at executive office. But everybody else, I mean, it's a reasonable response at Cajun Count, but you've still got 40% who are not strongly agreeing or agreeing with that proposition. And it gets down at the gaming machines to 33%. See that?
Yes.
So it suggests, doesn't it, that the executive office has a materially different perception from gaming staff about the behaviour and attitudes of executive staff?
There are differences in views.
So that
No,
leading from the
well,
top,
that-
that's not how the boots on the ground are seeing it. You would accept that?
I'd accept that leading from the top is there's a series of perceptions you can have on leading from the top. Clearly, it can get better.
Now, finally, Mr. Bossy, you've been at Crown Perth since 2011 and in a senior executive role since at least 2013. You would accept, wouldn't you, from some of the matters I've raised with you today and on the last occasion that you gave evidence that you've not done enough in the past in your role as COO in particular to adequately identify and manage material business risks at Perth Casino, particularly AML and RSG risks?
I think you've identified instances. I have worked closely with those teams just to try and develop our processes internally. I've worked with their leaders. Were there instances where I could have and should have done better? Yes. We're working and I'm leading with people, and part of our process are human engagements in all aspects. And that is also challenging.
Would you accept that as COO you did not do enough to establish within Crown Perth an appropriate risk and compliance culture?
I think if I take the total body of work, yes, I could have done more.
Would you accept that as COO you did not do enough to establish within Crown Perth an appropriate culture of integrity and accountability?
From my perspective, there was a lot of work that was done. I could have done more.
What do you say to the proposition that, having regard to your past conduct as COO, you are not the appropriate person to lead Crown Perth as CEO through this necessary period of cultural change?
I disagree with that.
Because?
Because to lead people and processes takes many aspects. Our business is material across multiple areas. The communication and engagement with team, as important as it is, can oscillate. It's something that you continuously work at. From my perspective, if you lead by values and a sense of right, that's what I try to do. I'm going to make mistakes. I accept that. And part of the process is for all of us to move forward, improve and get better at what we do.
Nothing further, Commissioners.
Thank you. Are there any applications?
Just one brief line for questioning, Commissioners. Mr. Bossy, my name's Mr. Sardinia. I appear for the Department of Local Government, Sports and Cultural Industries. Do you recall in the first 20 minutes of giving evidence about remediation, Commissioner Owen asked you two questions, in particular about the casino manual operations and the standard operating procedures? And you were asked how often they're being amended?
Yes.
You were asked, sorry, in particular,
Yeah.
whether Crown Perth is amending them as they go in line with the remediation efforts, or whether there's a catalogue of changes they're working towards?
Yes.
Sorry. Can I just clarify, is it correct that, is it your understanding that changes to the casino manual operations have to be submitted to the GWC and approved by that body?
Yes.
Yep.
And that's when we do the work, we do the updates and we send them through. We don't interim change them without appropriate approval.
Yes, whereas by contrast, the standard operating procedures don't have to be submitted to the GWC and they can be changed by Crown.
Yes?
Yes, so am I correct then in understanding that when you said those documents are being amended as Crown goes,
Yep.
the standard operating procedures are being amended, but proposals to amend the casino manual operations are being submitted to the GWC?
Yes, they are. So they're going at a different cadence.
Thank you, no further questions.
Thank you. Any other applications? Mr. Damananda?
Oh, sorry, I do have an application. Commissioner, thank you very much. Mr. Bossy, I appear on behalf of Morena Fuster. Earlier today, much earlier today, you gave some evidence about some discussions that you had with Mr. McCann and Mr. Carter about a decision that you stepped down from the board of Burswood Limited. Do you recall that?
Yes?
And in those discussions, was any decision reached about when you would step down from the board?
No, I'm not clear on timing.
And do you anticipate that when you will step down will also be the subject of a decision made in consultation with those two gentlemen?
It'll be a broader discussion than that.
Right. Now, I'm instructed by Ms. Fuster that you have not told her that you are stepping down from the board of Burswood Limited. Is that correct?
That process is still to work through. I've only just very recently understood that to be the case.
But my question is, have you told her about it?
I don't recall.
And if you haven't told her about it,
Yes.
given your position as CEO and as a co-director, is it not something you should have told her about?
Absolutely.
And can you think of any reason why you have not done that?
Recency of finding out. And I should have called her last night.
It's not the case that you haven't been told to tell her about it, is it?
No. No, that's not the case. It's a discussion about a future possibility likelihood. So I should have told her that's something that may happen.
Well, when you say possibility or likelihood, which do you mean?
I'm expecting to. That hasn't been finalised yet.
I want to ask you some questions as well about the local remediation plan. You gave evidence earlier today that that is a written document. I'm instructed by Ms. Fuster that she's not seen that. Have you provided her with a copy?
I have discussed the remediation plan with her.
Yes. Have you
I
provided
don't.
her with a copy?
I may. No, I don't.
And how long?
That sits within the remediation we're doing as Crown Resorts. It's a document that is a working document from the operational team's perspective. I'm not sure whether it was actually passed on to the board because we're using it as an operational document to get work done on the ground.
Right. And to your knowledge, does Mr. McCann and Mr. Carter have a copy of it?
No,
So you're the only one who's seen it?
it's the operational model on how we perform remediation in support of the broader resorts document that everyone has seen.
And there'd be no harm in providing Ms. Fuster with a copy of it?
No,
would
not
there?
at all. I have no problem with
The
that.
Commission, pleases.
Thank you, Mr. Power. Mr. Damananda?
Thank you, Commissioners. Mr. Bossy, you were asking questions in relation to the internal audit function. You recall that
Yes,
a long time ago this morning?
yes.
If we go, please, to CRW.701.005.9004. It's a board pack of a meeting of Burswood Limited for August of 2021. If we go, please, to page 9145. On private screens, please. see there's a reference to an internal audit update. And there's
Yes.
a reference with respect to the team, about the bottom of the page, in case it can be blown up.
Yeah.
Does that refresh your memory about the circumstances of the development of the team in Perth?
Yes, it does.
So it's the case that Nadine
Nadine's there,
Randall
yeah.
Westhausen has been promoted to that role in Perth, Mr. Bossy.
Yes.
You were also then asked some questions during the course of the afternoon about Patron AH. You recall that? Do you have that list for
Yes.
there? And you were taken to
Yes.
a series of documents concerning that patron. Can you comment on that patron's style of play when it comes to the manner in which he proceeded to play at the casino?
He has a set, typically set first stage buy-in. He plays, either he has his experience, or at the end of that first stage, he'll typically buy in a smaller or alternate amount after that. His buy-ins, however, historically have been 5, 10, 15, in some cases larger than that. So he does oscillate quite actively within that range of buy-ins.
Thank you. If we go please to CRL.563.002.3765, and this is an extract or the entirety of the bank statement for 1 January to 31 March for the South Bank Investments bank account. It should be on the private screen because there's patron information upon it, in it. So you'll see there that the report is from 1 January to 31 March 2018, some of which period covers the period of the examination in respect of patron AH. We go please to page 3791. And you'll see at about point 7 of the page a transfer from patron AH, and then at about, there's 2 of them. Do you notice those, Mr. Fossey?
I've got one. Yep, I've got the 2 of them.
And what amounts are they for?
The 2 lots of $10,000.
And then if you go, please, operator, to page 3792. About point 8 of the page, there's another entry there. Have you located it, Mr. Bossy?
No, I've got it. Yes.
What amount is that for?
I think that's 50,000 if it's the one you're looking at.
Yes, and
Yeah.
then if we go, please, to page 3810. Again, about point 8 of the page, there's another entry for patron AH. You located that, Mr. Bossy?
About 20,000.
So, that, Mr. Bossy, is consistent with what you told us about how this patron behaved. If I could then ask, please, the operator to go to CRL.701.009.5267. It does have the patron's name on it, so it should be private screen. shall I say the number again? CRW.701.009.5267. So you'll see that this is the player trip report for the relevant patron. Can you please assist us, Mr. Bossy, with interpreting what is occurring with respect to this patron, working through the columns?
First column is a reflection of those individual transactions accumulated largely. The top, I'll just put the top line, that's for the full year. The second line is the last 7 days. The second column gives you an indication of what the player's average bet is.
Yes.
Time spent, and then you get to actual and theoretical win, which are theoretical is based on an edge in terms of how the patron plays, and actual is his fixed result.
What does it say about what's occurred with the funds that he has drawn?
On that basis, he is playing normally, in the sense that actual and theoretical win are close. He's got significant time and significant bet. So that in my mind is what would deem fairly normal behaviour. If you look at the last 7 days, he's had an unlucky run.
And you'll recall that one of the transactions that Council Assisting took you to this morning was an approval given on the 27th of December 2018.
Yes.
What's occurred on that, judging from this player trip report in respect of those funds?
Over that time period, he has played significantly in terms of time period and spend, reflecting his pattern of buying.
Thank you. There's another document, Commissioners.
Just on that, I'd also suggest that the next 2 days going forward, he used the same chips to play as well.
Thank you, Mr. Bossy. This document, Commissioners, that from a regulatory perspective might enable only those that have given the relevant undertaking to examine.
Is this the last question you're going to ask?
No, there's one other. There's two other, Commissioner. Shall I return to this one at the end?
Please.
So, Mr. Bossy, it was. Is that document? You asked certain questions about the cheque cashing facility and whether there was contemplation of bringing it to an end as a result of the evidence that you gave in August. Do you recall that?
Yes.
If I could please ask you to look at this letter, it's apparently not yet loaded onto the system because it's a large document, but for the purposes of the transcript, it's CRW.700.074.0345. It's apparently on the system. So, I don't need to trouble you with hard copies. If you go, please, to the second page of that letter. This is a letter addressed to Miss Nicola Perry, the Chief Casino Officer, dated the 29th of July 2021. Go, please, to the second heading with respect to the cheque cashing facilities.
Yes.
Does that assist you with respect to your memory concerning the treatment of the cheque cashing facility, Mr. Bossy?
Yes.
So there was consideration being given to its cancellation because of decline of its use.
Correct. Agreed with that.
And you gave evidence in August, Mr. Bossy.
Yes, I did.
Mr. McGregor was asked some questions yesterday concerning EGMs and the capacity of Crown to continue if there was some restriction on the ability of the casino to operate EGMs. What's your reaction to that question, Mr. Bossy?
Restriction to operate, if that's a cessation of operation, then from a certainly from a Crown Perth perspective and beyond, it probably means the loss of a significant number of jobs. That is a significant business unit in terms of performance. If I had to describe its impact on our business, it's probably what iron ore means to BHP or dropping the iron ore price to $30. It's a material shift in the design and the way the business would operate. When I say significant job losses, we're talking about through a reduction in contribution that inevitably occurs and a reduction in the number of patrons that play machines. You'll have a reduction in the need and the use of many of our non-gaming facilities, hotels, restaurants, bars. And the flow and effect of that, we have some 850 or 900 local suppliers that have us as a major supplier of goods, have us as a major customer in terms of goods and services. That would inevitably impact a number of those with the decrement in the business. From our perspective, I also think that if we consider even last weekend with Telethon, our donations there got to 25 million across the last 12 years, I think. I think we'd have to reconsider potentially a policy of support for a lot of charitable and support work we do, whether historically we did food banks. From our staff perspective, we provided them hotel rooms when the fires were on, the support of Kalbarri and SES services, a lot of work we do in the market that would have to be reassessed, excluding the fact that there's potentially certain levels of debt we need to talk about. So I think there's substantial impacts as a result of that. The knock-on effects are hard to assess, but they're certainly going to be material.
Thank you. Commissioners are now at the point where...
I think this is unusual, but I think the most convenient way for us to proceed is for us to finish the public session and then go into private session right at the very end.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Any other applications? No. Mr. Bossy, I only have one question for you. We may have to bring up the executive team chart again, but I want to know where Mr. Yates fits. Which line would he fit in? Perhaps we better bring it up. CRW.701.009.5021. And I got the impression from what you said that you have confidence in Mr. Yates and he's playing a particular role in the area that was discussed.
He's assisting us in terms of our reviews of customers. The sources we have are national and global sources of information as well as local. If you can screen to the next page, he would be sitting on the other side of the... He's in the centralised functions, sitting, I think Simon Wiseman's new, I think he's sitting in that team, or Shannon Lindner. They're both new recruits. They sit within Steve Blackburn's team. He's in the investigations area of financial crimes. He got out here while our borders were open, so I got to spend a fair bit of time with him when he got out here. He operates out of Melbourne, but his knowledge base and support has been very helpful in terms of us achieving our objectives from a...
So he would fit in that middle line, in the middle of the page.
He'd been within those teams.
All right, thank you.
I only have a couple of things, Mr. Bossy. The first is about Mr. Petkoff. After Mr. Petkoff was arrested, was there any kind of audit or investigation carried out by the Perth casino to determine how a patron had gambled approximately $3 million of stolen funds at the Perth casino without the illegal conduct being detected?
We were in discussions, I should say Mr. Preston and I had a discussion with the team in terms of the timing. Firstly, why we didn't pick it up early, and secondly, why we didn't move quicker from my and his perspective. Mr. Petkov, I think, for a matter of accuracy, gambled about 1.2 million in Perth. But we should have, Mr. Preston and I both agreed we should have moved quicker.
So, apart from a discussion with Mr. Preston about you moving quicker, was there any kind of formal investigation to identify the risk failures?
I don't recall.
You told us, told Ms. Cahill that, in your view, there are now procedures in place that would be better at preventing such a failure occurring again.
Yes.
But if such a failure did occur, can you point us to a document which would say, this is Crown Perth's response to an identified failure in risk management, and these are the steps that Perth Casino will take to identify why the failure occurred, how the deficits will be plugged, so to speak, so that it doesn't occur again?
Currently, I can talk to where we're at. At the time, there were, I can't recall a document. I can recall requests for additional resources that were declined, which would have enhanced the AML and the RG teams. There's been over time, there were some requests for additional resources that, largely given the performance of the property, weren't approved at a senior level, beyond where Mr. Preston and I sat. If I look at today's framework that we have in place, Mr. Petkov would have been identified about 12 months earlier.
I'm not talking about improved AML procedures or improved RSG procedures. I'm asking, is there a document which Perth Casino has which says this is what we do if we identify a failure in risk management, to ensure that we identify why it's occurred and take steps to ensure it doesn't happen again?
I'm just trying to recall at a document level. There are processes we undertake rather than the documents. I can't think about those. I can't recall those at the moment, but there are processes that...
Look, I know it's late in the day, Mr. Bossy, so perhaps if you identify a document, you can let us know what it is.
I'd certainly like to do that if I can.
Thank you, that's fine. I wanted to talk about checks. I just want to understand, what is a house check?
A house check is if a customer wants to access a check cashing facility, there is a document that, rather than having a physical check of their own, there's a document that can print it up out of our system that inputs the customer details, the bank account that they have relating to the checking facility, the approval process that we have, and the customer then can sign it. It's effectively got all the same details that a cheque has, but it's just printed out of our system, consistent with any patron who's had an approval of a cheque limit.
Is it anything more than a promise to pay?
No,
with some associated bank account details?
my understanding of it is it's a bankable instrument consistent with a cheque that a payment is due to be received on.
That's what I'm trying to understand, Mr. Bossy,
Yeah.
because I understand if you have a chequebook that the
Yeah.
bank issues,
Yeah.
you sign it, then the bank, that's a promise to pay, by you and the bank, so to speak. But I'm just wondering what on earth a document signed only by the patron with his bank account details on it, how it amounts to a cheque.
No, all the details that you'll have on a cheque are replicated in the document that they sign. So it's got all the same details as a cheque, as a checking facility, and the customer then has a number of mechanisms under which they can either redeem that or claim a payment thereof, or we can claim a payment thereof.
And finally, in answer to the question from Mr. Damananda, you spoke about the detriments to the Perth Casino and the community if EGMs were not permitted at the Perth Casino. But would you agree with me that there'd also be community benefits?
Yes, there will be. There would be potentially elements of community benefit. However, with the appropriate frameworks and structures, I think we can work towards mitigating some of the risks we've discussed in the past, where I think
One of the community benefits would be that your patrons who lose 10% on average of their wages in EGMs would have that money to spend on other things.
possibly, but a large number of those also play lotto and other alternatives.
Thank you.
Mr. Shaw,
I only have 4 questions. Before I just come to those, I might try and see if I can assist with a question that Commissioner Jenkins asked about the house check. Is this a document, I think you've said, it has all the details that a personal cheque would have
Correct.
on it? So it's in effect a negotiable instrument, just like a cheque is.
Correct.
And it's a negotiable instrument that, when taken to a bank, is cashed in is paid into a Crown account,
Yes.
just the same way as a
Exactly the
personal
same
cheque
way
would
as a
be.
cheque. Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely.
Thank you. So it's not just a piece of paper with
No,
some
no,
details
no.
on. It's a negotiable
Correct.
instrument.
Bank negotiable instrument.
Thank you. You were asked some questions in relation to banning patrons. Now, I'm not going to mention patron names, but I want you to mention patron names. But is it correct to say that you have banned a number of prominent high net worth business people and sportsmen, either excluded from the Pearl Room or banned them altogether in the past?
Yes, I've had them removed and also large customers as well.
Thank you. In relation to present culture, I suppose, is it correct that you regularly attend staff forums to listen to concerns of staff?
I have a large number of meetings that I attend with staff. We do staff briefings on a regular basis, and staff ask me questions. I attend staff briefings and in terms of departmental briefings, and have conversations with teams in that forum as well, as leadership team meetings.
Thank you. In relation to COVID restrictions, is it correct that Crown Perth actually imposed tighter restrictions than were permitted under the COVID requirements for the protection of staff and patrons?
Yes, we maintained WA app scanning. We maintained sanitisation at significant levels. We restricted the number of devices and seats we made available to customers, even beyond the time period where we got to phase 5. We had scanning, or thermo scanning of staff as they entered our workplace. There are a number of factors like that we not only had above and beyond when we began, but maintained them well after we were able to remove them.
Thank you, Commissioners. The only last question. In relation to Pearl Room members, is it correct that Pearl Room members were required recently to complete customer information forms, and those who would not complete those forms were blocked from the Pearl Room?
Yes, we did that through the entire Pearl Room membership base. I think it was approximately 15%, 10 to 15% in that sort of range that didn't fill out the forms, were removed of their access, and that happened in the last period.
Would that be about 400 patrons?
Yeah, it'd be about 400, yes.
Thank you. Commissioners, I have no further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Shaw. We'll terminate the live streaming for the day, and if I could ask everyone to leave the room other than those who have completed the undertaking